While we are recording, the Sacramento City Council is having an emergency meeting.
The business folks, quote unquote, leaders are at it again.
They are at it again. And so there are lots of things that are probably questionable about this. Number one, emergency meetings should be reserved for emergencies. Number two, the agenda only has to be posted 24 hours in advance, giving very few people advance access to what is going to be discussed, or even that there is going to be a discussion. And in this case, the business before us isn't really even the business of the Sacramento City Council. It is the business of the business districts and their desire to push through the city council a measure for the ballot that they are currently collecting signatures for, but don't want to spend their own money on these signatures, and they want the council to put this on the ballot for free 99, which the council has the ability to do. Mm-hmm. So
they don't want to waste.
Yes,
they don't want to waste a week of spending laborers' wages that they've stolen on this evil measure that they're pushing. So Correct. They're trying to get the city council through city manager Howard Chan to do their work.
Which we'll get to the kind of what they're trying to do in a moment, but just a quick civics lesson for context. So when we have our elections, there are two ways that measures appear on our ballot, either because a legislative body votes to put them on, or because members of the community collect signatures. And so in the case of course, elected officials putting it on, all they have to do is vote in their body and it shows up on the ballot. Whereas if you're collecting signatures, you usually have to pay people to go out and collect those signatures because it requires a lot, and you need more than volunteers to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And so
basically
that's why people want your elected officials to put things on the ballot, because it's free.
Yeah. And so the topic of today's show is not on this very, very important homelessness topic, right? The topic of today's show is going to be on the mass shooting that happened over the weekend here in Sacramento, the largest we've ever had in our city. But we're forced to touch on this because of these tone-deaf, horrible folks in the business community pushing this last-minute meeting for a last minute out of nowhere vote while everybody else is trying to process what just happened over the weekend. I don't think I can stress enough just how horrible that is. And we can name names here, right? I don't know who this Conway guy is. Isn't he from LA?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, he's trying to push this law in LA. He's coming up here for this. Then we've got, the Barry Broom types of GSEC. We've got, I saw Josh Wood up there on the dais today of, what is it? Region Business. Although now he's just with that right-wing Democratic PR firm on I Street. With the Townsends, David Townsends and those folks. And then Amanda Blackwood of the Metro Chamber is up there. All of these folks are working with City Manager Howard Chan to really circumvent really any public discourse on this. And it's a horrific look.
Well, it's a horrific look. And I feel like even to the topic that we're going to talk about today, there's always the discussion of equity that's at play. And in this case, I'm thinking about the equity of who's allowed that audience, what convenience looks like, or inconvenience for that matter. The fact that the business district, which is about making money, doesn't want to spend money to push their agenda forward. It's interesting that city council would say, we'll go ahead and take a vote on this where you have half the signatures that you probably need to get to a ballot measure, whereas most community driven ballot measures, they want to see the full number, and then they want to do a verification of those signatures. So again, who's prioritized within, we're going to actually take governments into action versus who's forced to fight for the pennies and scraps just to get justice and equity. I think it's always fascinating to see how often our city that has an elected body of Democrats move in that way. But I digress.
Not to mention the fact that they're alleging, they're claiming that they have half of the signatures that they need, but those signatures have not been verified yet. So we have no clue whether or not that's actually true. And so to take this up as an emergency meeting is an expenditure of resources, of city resources. It is essentially allowing them to set the agenda that our city council takes up. And I'd just like to draw the stark contrast to, when Sac Kids First was introducing Measure G in 2020, which was to be able to set aside part of the budget for services focused to youth and youth programming and just general funding youth initiatives, or even when renters' rights advocates wanted to pass their Measure C and establish rent control, and neither of those were taken up for vote by the council.
Where was the urgency there?
It's really
Daryl?
interesting,
Yeah.
especially because the deadline for this, if this is going to go on the November ballot, isn't until early August. So the only reason to take this up as an emergency right now is because they don't want to continue to spend money collecting
rich
signatures.
folks want them to do it. Yeah.
So just so we're clear,
Did we even say what this is?
No, we haven't said what it is yet, but I just want to point out that this is an example of corporate welfare.
Yeah.
Well,
and so don't turn around and ask about people taking, public money for their basic human needs when businesses can waste this much money, even in the time that was spent tonight. Even if the council doesn't agree to put this on the ballot, the time that was spent tonight is wasted money on their interest and nobody else's. And if they do take it up, then they're able to save money and avoid having to spend money to do something that community advocates and renters and people with the fewest resources in our community had to go out and through their own sweat equity put on a ballot. And that should be, everybody on there should be shamed for that, because that's disgraceful.
Yep.
So just for clarity, the emergency in the situation is the saving of dollars for business interests.
Right.
Correct.
I mean,
Correct.
I can't not miss that. Okay, I just want to make sure.
We couldn't open
100%.
homeless shelters last January when we had a storm that ended up killing 6 people. We couldn't do that during the emergency meeting, but we can set an emergency meeting specifically for the business interests in Sacramento. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so just for folks, this is a massive omnibus approach to homelessness in our region that they're pushing forward here, that would make it compulsory for the city to create beds. It doesn't say what kind, doesn't say how, doesn't say, what standards for the people's quality of life who would have to sleep in those beds. And then it makes it compulsory for folks on the street to take them. And then it tries to circumvent Boise decision, which basically determined that if you're going to harass folks sleeping on the streets and you don't have a bed for them, then that's unconstitutional. That is cruel and unusual punishment. It's trying to do all of these things, and they're taking 24 hours to try and get the city to act on these business interests, when the people haven't even had a chance to breathe after this fucking mass shooting. It is unconscionable. I think I know the hearts of Barry Broom and Josh Wood and Howard Chan. I'm a little surprised at Amanda on this one too.
Yeah, it's just disappointing. Business gone business.
Looks like it. Well,
and it's the role of government to limit them, because honestly, in this, they're playing their role, right? Their role is to try to squeeze as much out of everyone as possible. And the government's role is to say, no.
Mm-hmm.
We protect the interests of people. So that's, I think, what's most disappointing today, is that agendas were set to even waste everyone's time to have to decide on this tonight. And that was the first misstep. And then whatever happens tonight is just an exacerbation of that.
Yeah. And we're recording as this meeting wraps up, so we don't know. But I'm sure you'll be able to see an article by some reporter whose name maybe rhymes with Clee Tift or something in the morning. But for now, can we talk about what we came here to talk about?
We can.
I think we can. I think that's a good time to get into it.
All right, let's start the show.
Voices, the things they said. voices, some from those dead, all the voices heard. Voices, things we say, voices, they're in your head, all the voices heard.
Hello, everyone. You have Kempa.
And Flo.
And Ryan.
And Ryan.
And a very special guest today, our good friend Ryan McClinton. Ryan is program manager at Public Health Advocates, so a colleague of Flo's,
Woo woo.
community
Woo-hoo.
organizer and longtime Sacramento resident or lifetime Sacramento resident. Ryan, so excited to have you. Obviously, we don't have Shannon and Skylar on. They've both got things to be doing right now. But I think this is going to be a really important episode, and we had to put it off a couple days. But I think, honestly, the few days really allows us, after the mass shooting in downtown Sacramento, it kind of allows us to speak on this topic with a little less of a knee-jerk reaction. So I think this is going to be, I think it's going to be a good thing. But first things first, Ryan, longtime friend of the show. I feel like I see you like once every 3 weeks when I walk out the door. How are you?
I'm good. Honestly, I've been anxiously awaiting my chance to join Voices and have some of the great discussions that happen. Yeah, it's been a week for sure, as it's been for everybody in Sacramento, and even outside of Sacramento, just realizing what happens. But I think something that you said that's really important to me, Kempa, is that part of letting it breathe. When we think about trauma so often, it's something that's we're stuck in, right? And there's an immediacy to it. I think the other thing that hurts so much from it is that there's never really time to process it and understand like what just happened. So that time in between of like what happened Saturday or Saturday morning, Sunday morning, and to where we're now at Wednesday, and you actually have found out a lot more information, you can understand what's going on. I think we needed that. I think there's a rush to speak to things sometimes and you don't know all the information. I think that's harmful, especially with traumatic incidents like that, because as we'll talk about tonight, narratives go all types of ways and whatnot. And it's a part of where do we rein that in and actually get to the source of the issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's get into it then. First things first for folks, Ryan, your work with, professionally is generally around alternatives to policing, correct?
Yeah, currently I'm at Public Health Advocates, where I'm focusing on a campaign around first response transformation. So how do we look at the systems that have been our go-to for safety and in crisis situations and recognize, are they equitably responding? Are they giving us the responses that we need for our communities? And is it the best way to do it? I think for me, it was an evolution of the work I had previously been doing for about 5 years or so, or 4 to 5 years, around gun violence intervention, reducing mass incarceration, reducing violence in Black and Brown communities, and really finding ways to empower our communities to be safer from their own volition and from their own leadership. So when you look at the first response system as it is now, I think we're really at a critical time to look at, are we defining public safety the right way? Are we defining first response the right way? And are we really understanding what's happening in these moments like Saturday or Sunday morning's unfortunate events to really get to solutions that work?
Yeah. I'm really really thankful we got to have you on today for this. And very honestly, it's kind of serendipitous. I was walking up to K Street. I ran into you basically on K and 10th where all of this happened. And we just started chatting and probably for about 10 minutes. And I was like, man, it'd be really nice to have you on the show if we could get you this week. So I'm glad we got you. Why don't we start with just the facts of what happened in Sacramento on Saturday night / Sunday morning, right? Why don't you two leave this part to me, fill in the blanks as we go. But I think, with Ryan's expertise and Flo's expertise as a public health professional, like I'm going to be doing more asking questions as we go on. Basically, effectively, Sunday morning around 2 a.m. in downtown Sacramento, around the corner of 10th and K Street. This is, just like 2 blocks from the state capitol. There's a good number of nightclubs, bars, all these different things over there, and it usually gets kind of popping over the weekends, right? At this time, there was effectively a mass shooting, right? So far, what we know is from what the police have told us, right? Police have said that there have been at least 5 shooters. They found at least 100 shell casings, which means at least 100 bullets were shot, but I've seen estimates up to over 200. 6 people died in this, 3 men, 3 women, varying ages from like 21 all the way into their 50s. One woman, in fact, was unhoused and had, been sleeping in a little alcove right by there for years and years. So there are many sort of different directions to this story. As we found over the week, 2 people were arrested directly related to this. We don't need to even release names on this show. I kind of don't believe in doing that on something like this. But they were on gun charges. One was on gun assault, which I'm not sure necessarily what that means. One of them is in jail currently on not allowed to be released, no bail. The other one, who is his sibling, is, I believe, currently in the hospital and will be taken to jail and arraigned once he's deemed healthy enough for that. And then a third person's been arrested. Really, they have nothing necessarily on this other than the fact that there is footage with this person holding a gun, and this person is not legally allowed to hold a gun. I don't know why this is ending up in the stories, but look at this. Here I am now bringing this up as well. That's what we know so far. Am I missing anything?
Not so far.
Okay.
That's straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, like, let's do an initial response as community advocates, as human beings who are Sacramento residents. What's the initial response that we have on this?
If I can jump in for one quick second and ask for a little grace on time of it. One thing I definitely would like us to do is to honor the lives that were lost, especially innocent lives.
Yes, thank you, Ryan.
No problem. Yeah, just a few moments of silence, just to in respect to those lives and their loved ones. Yeah.
Should we talk about who did die that night? Should we give their names?
I think that would be respectful.
Okay. So there was Sergio Harris, 38, of North Highlands, Devatzia Turner, 29, of Carmichael, Joshua Hoy Lucchesi, 32, of Salinas. Did I pronounce that correctly? Salinas. I always get that wrong. I'm sorry. Those were the 3 men who died. 3 women were Jantaya Alexander of Elk Grove, 21, Melinda Davis, who had been living over there around K Street in an alcove, 57, known very well by a lot of local advocates, and Yamil Martinez Andrade, 21, of Selma in Fresno County. And thank you again for that, Ryan.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think when we talk about those initial reactions, for me, it always starts with the humanity. Those are 6 lives, regardless of what was happening in their lives. at that point in time that are no longer here, that didn't need to be taken away from us. And, you know, for a number of years, I did gun violence intervention in response to active shootings and, you know, showing up on scenes where, you know, there's tons of loved ones who are there trying to make sense of the loss that's happened. And I appreciate that we name those victims and those lost lives here as well. But it's a tragic loss, you know. I it was weird because I couldn't sleep well that night. About 2:30, 3 o'clock, I woke up and I just remember like jumping up and I'm like, okay, it's just a bad night of sleep. Go back to sleep an hour later, I wake up again and something tells me to check my phone. And I'm receiving text messages from friends who used to live in Sacramento who are now on the East Coast saying, hey, are you okay? Are you good? I'm like, of course I'm fine. I'm at home. But then I look at KCRA and I see that was the first outlet I seen that reported the story that there was a mass shooting downtown. And my mind started immediately going to the intervention workers and the folks who are likely to be there at that time and have probably been out there for several hours at that point, to understand like what's happened and try to mitigate any further harm. And then it's putting the story together of what actually happened, right? You know, read a news article at the initial stages, there's probably 5 lines, no more than 6 sentences that say shooting down here, this many people harmed, more details to come. You look at video clips, they're just regurgitating the same information because they're trying to get it as quickly as possible. And I think the other part of it that comes from the gun violence intervention piece of it is that we often say the streets talk faster than news outlets. So then starting to turn to those sources to like get more and more pieces to the story. But at that point, you're still trying to make sense of it all, like what happened and what caused it and what spiraled. And I couldn't rest beyond that. Like it was just disruptive. Flo, how did it hit you? If I may ask.
Yeah, I was awakened at about 5 a.m. or so from a call actually from the East Coast, and from one of my like favorite people in life and that I've known my entire life. And he called and was just like, are you alive? Are you okay? And I was just like, I didn't know what had happened because I was asleep. And then I checked and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to reach out to one of my colleagues who was in town because I had just dropped him off a block from there several hours before this happened. And really, I was, just thinking about the fact that the only reason that we had not chosen to go out, on the town while he was in town was because we were exhausted from prepping for this meeting on Monday. And we were just both like, yeah, let's just go to sleep. But it was, just, recognizing just how close you come to things because it very much very easily could have been us out on K Street that night, trying to find something to do and to hang out. So that was how I learned about it. And then of course, just recognizing what this means for the city, what this means in terms of the conversations that are going to come, right? Like I was thinking about, a time 3 years ago when we were out and we were reeling from a mass shooting while learning about the next mass shooting, right? And there's something just really, uniquely and pathologically American about that phenomenon. And the way in which we wring our hands and pretend as if this is inevitable. There was an Onion, I think, a headline, which is, of course, a satire publication that said, unable to understand or comprehend mass shootings by only nation where this type of thing happens regularly, right? It's just like, we do have to look at, this is not unknown. There's research and bodies of work around this. And just because the common conversation around this is, oh my gosh, crime, gee, I don't know, right? Which is a quote from the West Wing from the late 90s, but like actually crime, gee, we do know. There's entire bodies of scholarship. And if you don't know, say that, but don't say we don't know because we do.
Oof. Maybe we start with that we do know. And that wasn't the next topic, but I think that maybe it should be. We talk a lot about gun violence in this country. It's a country of 360 million people. There are more guns out here around the nation than there are adults living in this country, right? And this is a reality we live with here. When we talk about gun violence, there are some determinants to them, right? So I guess Flo, as a public health professional, maybe you start us out with that. Like, what are these determinants to gun violence? And yeah, maybe I should preface this with a lot of, if not overtly racist rhetoric, somewhat dog whistle rhetoric starts coming out around times like this, with shootings like this. And it's really, really fucking unnecessary. Not just that, but also downright fucking wrong. With that being the precursor to this, can you talk us through some of the determinants to gun violence?
Sure. So, shout out to the Rise Center in Richmond for, just developing some really easily accessible frameworks around, the types of things, the types of phenomena we see in human populations. But dehumanization and distress, right, is what is ultimately at the root of so many of the challenges that we see, but especially violence. And dehumanization and distress comes from all of the policy decisions that we make about how we are going to govern ourselves and whether or not we are going to care for people. And so when poverty is a policy decision, it's not a moral failing. So when we make the decisions to allow people to exist without their basic needs being met, we have made a decision that we know is a known predictor of increasing violence. Concentrating people with traumatic histories in one place and then imposing institutional violence on them is another known determinant of violence. So we understand we have again vast bodies of work talking about how when we don't have affordable housing for people, when we don't provide ways for people to be able to have work that pays a livable wage, when we don't provide childcare in communities, and therefore people are left to decide between being able to provide for their families or being able to care for their children, we're leaving children often unsupervised at times because we're trying to make sure that they have a place to live. And that is one of the, like having, no activities and no supervision between 3 and 6 p.m. is a known predictor of, of youth violence, right? And so just there are things we already know that we've made conscious decisions not to address. And if we did, we could certainly decrease violence. And some of them are big ones that we talk about on this podcast a lot. But certainly they are known and they are actionable. And that is the takeaway message for this. And Ryan, of course, is over First Responder Transformation, has been doing a lot of violence prevention work. So I think, he can further elaborate on that. I'm sure he wants to double dutch in here.
Yeah. I think the other thing too that's important, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit tonight, but the types of gun violence, or at least the types of incidences of gun violence, I probably didn't say that right, but blame it on my brain, really have a huge factor to play when you're talking about those determinants of it, right? Like in my brain and what I've seen from doing that gun violence and enriched work, like we're talking about a very specific lane of violence and gun violence, which tends to be classified as gang violence or community gun violence, right? Where the factors of the area that you live in are in such dire straits that you're having to make decisions that lead to you picking up a gun. So there's specific gun violence intervention programs, shout out Advance Peace, that look at targeting those who are most likely to pick up a gun and fire it to change some of those determinants, or at least start shifting some of those priorities. But then you look at the other side of it, and there's a part, and I'm trying not to tease too much into it, but when we talk about mass shootings, there's a assumption that Americans make around what a mass shooting means and who's involved with that. And then the next jump from there is terrorism, right? Which I'd say it's terrorism.
I mean, feel free to flesh this out.
Well, let's get into it. So yeah, when you talk about a mass shooting, let's call it what it is. Usually we think of, white American males that have a bone to pick or axe to grind. Usually it's associated with a hate crime of some sort or some deep seated hurt that they've encountered. What's interesting about this dynamic, though, is that you're still talking about the dynamics of mental health and what that support looks like. Now, the access looks very different in those two situations, right? We know by the statistics, it's very well known, right? Our communities of color, African American communities are vastly underdiagnosed and underserved when it comes to mental health. And there's a big stigma around it in Black and Brown communities, yet the problem still persists of trauma and how it's addressed, or if not addressed, resulting in the outcome of gun violence, right? But I think they're very two different microcosms of it, right? This was horrible in a number of ways because we've seen so many innocent lives taken. But I think in one of the articles, I think it was the LA Times, and I rarely like to give love in any way, shape, or form to policing because I think there's so many harms that need to be addressed from policing first before we continue to pat them on the back for the job they've done. But our local police chief did say something that I thought was very true. She said, we're seeing a very public display that our communities know all too well in terms of some of the community violence that happens and the gun violence that happens, where there's innocent people that are lost by gun violence, right? I think that's a different set of determinants than the mass shooter, white male taking out mass victims, right? There's very different circumstances of what that support looks like to prevent that. So
there's a societal illness of also white supremacy that is a determinant to those shootings, that it's a different
it's all
approach.
Structural. It's all structural when you look at it. Like all the violence is structural, and it's who ends up being the actor is based on their positionality in the structure, right? So the actor that is a disaffected white man is someone who is supposed to have power, does not, and therefore because of access and proximity to guns, then is able to inflict violence on people. And then we have a conversation about their mental health and what we need to do. But when the perpetrator is someone who is browner, right, then depending on what type of brown person they are, we either have the conversation about terrorism and the perils of usually a religion that is no more or less violent than any of its counterparts, or we have a conversation about, people on people violence, because I refuse to use the term that is used to talk about interpersonal violence in a way that maligns a particular community. And then we start talking about, why we care about that more than, why we don't care about that as much as we care about institutional violence. And I always say, like, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And anybody who says we don't care about those things is not paying very close attention, because we do. And anybody who says we don't care about those things has not been paying attention to the cries for more money for schools and more money for housing and more money to address mental health and all of the movements that have been happening that aren't always happening necessarily in the streets, but certainly on a day-to-day basis to get more resources for the things that we know. And those are all violence prevention, approaches. They may not be couched or framed that way, but they certainly have that impact. And it's really frustrating to hear the narrative kind of come up and to know that based on who and based on their positionality in the hierarchy, that the conversation is going to be framed differently, when all of it needs to be talking about systems, all of it needs to be talking about, positionality, and all of it needs to be talking about mental health, because traumatized people often traumatize other people. And so when I hear somebody shot 6 people, their background and their religion and their race or ethnicity and their gang affiliation and all of those things are certainly important factors, but at the end of the day, they should not determine how we frame this.
Right.
And they unfortunately do.
We are products of our environments. And Flo, you give that famous Darth Vader discussion at your public health conferences that everyone
one of
loves.
my favorites.
I know,
If anybody hasn't had,
that.
I gotta plug it. If anybody hasn't had a chance to hear that presentation, I highly encourage you to search YouTube, because we've just been in 2 years of Zoom, so I'm sure it's recorded somewhere that you can view this. But Flo's Darth Vader Star Wars analogy to mental health and the needs there is some of the highest level that you can get, and everybody will understand it. So I highly recommend it. But it's one of my favorite.
Flo, give like a 30 to 60 second, You effectively are arguing in this speech that there are certain traumas that we deal with in our youth that will determine how well adjusted to a society, our society, we will be.
Yeah, so basically it's, taking kind of Anakin's progression to Darth Vader and showing very predictable patterns of what we often describe as life course theory of what happens at various points in your life, increasing the risk for other things happening in your life. And so his life looks maybe surprisingly to some people, but characteristic of what we would expect for someone who was born into slavery, was, separated from his parent at a young age, exposed to violence via the Clone Wars, right, and had very few in the way of protective factors, and so that's what we see, and it's a story so common that it shows up in fiction, right? Like that the question we all asked ourselves in episode 4, 5, and 6 is how did this happen, and then we were filled in with a story of basically childhood trauma, right? And it's like, oh, that's how this happens, right? We've all seen this story before. We read this book, so yeah, that's essentially the Cliff's Notes version. And then hopefully you never see Darth Vader quite the same way again, and you start to explore the backstory of all of your heroes and villains is often one protective factor difference, right? Like for Batman, the difference between him being the Joker and not is Alfred, right? Like he had a trusted adult relationship that was meaningful in his life and helped him deal with his childhood trauma. He also was rich, but those two things together
That
really
helps.
helped make things work out for him, right? And so and the Joker was decidedly not in most of the stories that carry him through, right? And so and also does not have a mentor or trusted relationship, and so it's just one or two factors that when you change them are the difference between somebody being able to tolerate the stress that is in their lives and not being able to, and it showing up in ways that impact everybody around them.
And I think that like highlights, and that's why I love that story that you give, that walk that you give, because it highlights so many points of intervention that things can be shifted and changed, right? When we talk about that childhood trauma and how long it goes unaddressed and unrecognized and everything that's built upon it, it's like, oh gosh, you could see how many systems have failed this baby coming through and now ends up on the wrong side of something, right? I want to go back to something too that you highlighted, and as you were giving that breakdown, is that when we talk about how brown you are in these incidents of violence that come in, what we don't talk about is mental health. It
Right.
doesn't come up.
Never.
It does not come up. It's not even a last thing that comes up. It just doesn't come up at all.
Brown people are pathological, white people are hurt. That is the takeaway message.
Right.
We're super predators, and these people needed help and a hug.
Right.
Classic
but we wonder why the
90s liberal rhetoric, actually, right there.
and we wonder why the stigmas are so strong today, right? That it's like, oh, well, you don't have mental health, or if you do, you just need to deal with it. It's a behavior issue. It's not, it couldn't possibly be that you were harmed so badly that your brain couldn't process the information. So it started finding other ways to cope with what you experienced, and now looks at life in a different lens of how you kind of move forward. That's not possible at all. It's what drives so much of the work that I do, not only with public health advocates, but in outside spaces, right? Like I feel like I scream at the mountaintops of, hey, Black people need mental health. I'm gonna just say it very clearly because and let me say it even more clear than that. Black people need access to mental health that's culturally competent.
Yes.
Because the way that it's framed, usually it's not framed for our demographic.
Right. And if you get some white, like therapist who has no understanding of your context, who you are, like how far do you think that's going to go?
But
and
how
also
damaging.
like what's possible, because I mean, I love organizations like the NAT Ministry and others that really kind of push back against our systems, because I think it's really important. It's also really important to recognize that like some of the challenge that we're facing isn't going to go away with just individual one-on-one services, because the problem is structural, right? Just like poverty isn't going to go away with a financial management class. I have more month than money. And no amount of Excel spreadsheets is going to fix that, right? Like I also need more money, right? Like sure, I can make better choices. I still need more money. Like there's just not enough. And the same thing is true for dealing with our mental health. It's like, sure, there are things that are chemical, there are things that are are individual and are social, but there's also the structural component to it. And if part of what is affecting my mental health is the low regard that society has for me because I am Black, or I am trans, or I am queer, or I am disabled, or I am all of these things, I am unhoused, we also have to address that. That's not going to go away just because I find a way to take baths and meditate twice a day. Like some of these things also, I need better coping skills, certainly. And I need to address the physical aspects
material
of this.
Conditions, right?
But I also need a lower dosage of adversity, right? If I was being poisoned by something, you would not teach me to deal with the poison. You would also try to stop me from being poisoned. And I think that's a part of the conversation that needs to be lifted up a lot more, is some of what we're seeing is actually not people being, is not people experiencing a crisis of unknown, source. It's actually that we have failed in our responsibility to not harm people. And so they're showing up in the ways that harm people showed up.
Yeah, oh, go ahead. Goodness, sorry about that.
Well, I just want to move it on because I know we only have about 20 minutes left. You two have talked very sort of, you've really painted a picture on like what determinants are and kind of like why we are where we are and why somebody might end up in this situation where they commit gun violence. I want to ask about some of the potential answers, how to fix this, right? Because I think that our city has toyed with a couple programs on violence prevention with young folks. But you look at some old shitty conservative Democrats like, oh, I don't know, Steve Maviglio claiming that those didn't work. And I want you to, because you two know this program pretty well. Can you speak to what this program was, how it worked, and kind of discuss that?
You want to go ahead?
Well, let me ask clarifying, just because I may be missing the context a little bit. Are we talking about a recent program or an older program? Because there's been a couple iterations of the city trying to address like gun violence and some of that, but and each one of them have sunsetted in some way or shape or form, even when they've seen evidence. So
okay, the one I'm talking about, I don't have the name of it in front of me, but like Flo, I think you worked with some of the kids.
Advanced Peace.
Advanced Peace, yeah.
Yes.
Talk to me about that.
Sure.
Yeah. I wish I didn't talk as much before, because there's so much to go into it with the advanced piece of it.
Go. We got time.
So yeah, I fortunately was able to be one of the community organizers that really helped with a bunch of community stakeholders really push our city to consider implementing this program. And we were the second city to implement it, right? So it's an innovative approach. And whenever we talk about innovation, city and government officials love to get very, very conservative and saying, oh, we don't have the evidence-based practice behind it. We don't know if all these other factors will implement. Well, we saw in a city like Richmond, shout out to the Rice Center again, in that area, where they actually had great success in seeing huge reductions in gun violence. And just from a personal perspective, being a native of South Sacramento, Valley High, gotta give shout outs there. One of the things I always knew about growing up was I didn't want to go to Richmond and get, especially at night, because I knew about the gun violence out there. I knew how likely it was that I would die just getting caught up in the wrong circumstance in Richmond. That's how bad it was. I'm giving that for context sake. But to see this program, Advanced Peace, implemented and actually start seeing huge reductions in their gun violence, I'm talking about, I think it went 40, 50 to 60% over, I want to say it was like a 10-year period of where they were built this in, was huge. And it's still huge because it's still having the same impact. When we brought it to Sacramento, the city's argument, they said we definitely need it. They recognize that there's a need for it. However, the challenge was, well, we don't want to be married to it. we want to have an out because we don't want to give this much money to incarcerated folks or formerly incarcerated folks or gang members to stop shooting. Well, if you're giving a third of our budget to law enforcement to get them to stop shooting, it's not working, why wouldn't we consider giving a significant amount to an intervention strategy that can actually see it move? So fast forward to us.
And just so folks know, we continue to add more and more money to our police. Like anyone claiming that we have defunded them in any way in Sacramento, that's not true.
Just lying. It's just lying and hasn't read the budget. I also want to jump in here and say, I just want to point out again the structural, the racial triangulation that happened around this, because when advanced peace becoming, it basically became a way for, in particular, a white and at the time the only woman on the dais who repeatedly stands in alignment with law enforcement to essentially try to play Black people against Black people, and so invoke the names of friends who do good work, but just recognizing that violence prevention has a spectrum. And so there's the primary prevention things, which are all of the community investments we make, and then there's secondary prevention, which is preventing harm among people who are at risk, right? So primary prevention for something would be like, let's take diabetes, for example, would be you having access to clean air and water and nutritious food and all of that. And secondary prevention would be testing people's A1C and then trying to intervene in a more specific way among people who have pre-diabetes, who are at risk for developing diabetes. And so certainly we want to invest in primary prevention, but the secondary prevention is also incredibly important. We don't want to let the people at high risk go on to become diabetic because we failed to act. And so I would describe advanced peace as secondary prevention, and a lot of the violence prevention programs are primary prevention, which is necessary and good. And it is deeply hurtful and downright irresponsible to pit the primary prevention folks against the secondary prevention folks because they need each other. And this city council member, Angelique Ashby, tried to do exactly
I was
that.
gonna say, you gotta just say the name.
Tried to say, oh, well, there are already people who are here in Sacramento doing this work, and I don't think we should fund this other entity, this other program that wasn't started in Sacramento to do it. And it's like, so we can't learn from another city because they're not Sacramento? Make that make sense to me. And why on earth would then you start trying to make it so that organizations that are underfunded for their primary prevention work are now being pitted against an organization that you don't want to fund for secondary prevention work? Like, there's enough money for everyone, Angelique, if you do the right thing. And you just stand on the side of not wanting to do that. And so this becomes a problem. So I just want to call out, that was racial triangulation.
Yes.
It was inappropriate. It's insidious in the way that we operate. We make people of color, in particular Black people, often scramble for scraps and infight against each other for a small pot of money while somebody else secures the entire bag, and that somebody else being the POA, the Police Officers Association. So we see you. It's not cool, and we've got your number. So just remember that, because that was not okay, and we didn't forget.
Angelique's biggest donors during her time in District 1 in Sacramento have been the affluent white folks of the external suburbs. Her favorite lunch is boot burgers with cheese. Like we know what Angelique's about.
This is a fact, and it was extremely disheartening to see that argument as a proposal when we met with Angelique on a number of occasions to say, hey, why aren't you in support of this program, right? She ended up trying to boil it down to codified language, right? I'm worried about our investments in being in here and being stuck to something that doesn't work. It's like, well, you're already painting a picture of it not working because Richmond has different factors. But the funny thing was, the factors that she cited were the exact factors that we were walking into with Sacramento. She said in Richmond, they just underwent a new police chief. We were just bringing in Dan Hahn. In Richmond, that they just had a massive community trauma. We were just experiencing that recently. So it was very interesting that these are your
arguments. The trauma we were experiencing was Stephon Clark?
No, not yet. This predated Stephon Clark. This was, the culmination of several community shootings that brought the energy to Stephon Clark. Joseph Mann, the Meadowview shooting specifically. And I have to say something, which I got to give him a shout out because it was something that he said very true. He was cited in the LA Times article, Barry Axios, where at that shooting that happened at Meadowview Park in South Sacramento, he said something that was very profound to me as a resident. He said, "This is not normal. We can't act like this is normal."
Mhm.
And that's such a key statement because for somebody who grew up in that very neighborhood, I didn't realize how normal that was to me. My reaction wasn't, dang, we had a loss of life. Man, what's going to happen to these kids who were here? And like, none of that was my thought. My next thought was, oh, you just activated OGs who are going to come back into the streets and it's going to be more shooting, because that's what happens in these situations, right? But it made me check, oh, wait a minute, what trauma am I walking in? And if I'm walking in that trauma, what's happening to everybody else around here? So I say that to say what Advanced Peace was introducing to do was truly groundbreaking, because it's like, hey, the person that you're most afraid of, has anybody talked to them? Has anybody seen what their needs are? Has anybody understood that they're making a set of choices based on, again, what Flo's talking about, right? Those primary investments of my life situation is messed up where I don't have stable housing. My mother has to work 3 or 4 jobs and probably is put in high risk situations that leave me in high risk situations where I'm experiencing other levels of trauma, right? I have to find ways to provide, right? That all these different things that lead to a path where you're trying to find the best decision to secure your finances, but also secure yourself, your personhood, and often associate with groups that have different interests and lead into that life. But where Advanced Peace was stepping in was to say, hey, how do we take that person and start introducing them to these other parts that allow them to make different choices from picking up a gun that lead to that conflict, right? In the first year of implementing it, Sacramento happened to see for the first year 0 gun violence in our teen youth, or 0 youth homicides, in that first year that it was implemented. Now, of course, you could add other factors to that, but similar to what you lifted up, Flo and I had
incredible.
a chance. It's amazing, especially for a community where the age of shooters, active shooters, was dropping lower and lower. We've seen active shooters in the past 2 years as young as 13 years old, 12 years old in some situations, right? So to recognize that that's a huge impact immediately within your first year of implementing the program, and them recognizing like this is who we have to target, and I don't like the language of target, but this is who we have to make sure that we're prioritizing and reaching out to, as well as the other folks that are known, was huge. But the thing that troubled me most with our city council and our city governments was they were constantly looking at, how do we get out of this? We don't want to be on the hook for this. But it's like, well, this is public safety. This is investment into communities that actually is showing tangible results. Yet you rather push the responsibility somewhere else and drive the funding in another direction, but you're seeing evidence here. So what's the real investment at that point?
It's classic myopia, right? I mean, it's they are responding to the rich folks that pay their campaigns, that are like, I want red blood justice, I want red meat justice, I want somebody to pay for this crime, and like, trying to get more cops like an Angelique type. Like Angelique, again, like naturally, it's very simple. Like, she dehumanizes folks that are potential shooters, right? Like, by saying that it's not worth it in investing in this, and saying that we should just invest more and more and more in the police, is saying that I'm just going to wait for these, to use Bill Clinton era 90s terms, these super predators to act so that we can put them in prison for years and years. And it's so myopic, and we have to flip that. We have to flip that narrative. And I mean, I guess like that's the work that you're doing, that Flo's doing as well.
But the problem here, Dave, and I really feel like I can't say this enough, is that, so, there are the people out there who would say, well, we want, police on the streets because we want them to solve these cases and we want them to keep us safe, right? Like that is their like they are earnest in their assessment. And I would say, okay, scratch that just a little bit, because in the city of Sacramento, our police department has repeatedly refused to provide any performance metrics other than how many officers we purchased and how much that costs us. But we have not been able to get from them, what is the impact? Like, you're constantly telling us you need more officers, but you can't explain to me what they do. They only solve, less than 40% of cases. And so I'm really confused about how any of this makes us safer. And so if somebody in the police department could draw me a logic model between the investment of over half of our budget that we give you and the outcomes that we're actually seeing, I would be most appreciative, because right now I've not seen that. The performance metrics that our city manager owes to the city and promised last year in the budget are still not to be found on any on the website or anywhere in the dashboard. The Measure U committee has been asking for them. So I'm at a place now where I'm saying, piss or get off the pot. So you tell me that we're spending all this money because it's doing all these great things. I'm from the show me state. I'm not really. That's Missouri. I'm from Pennsylvania.
Well,
but show me what that means in black and white, because you keep telling me this has to happen. And it feels a little bit like a sunk cost estimate of, we've already spent so much money on the police, we just have to keep doing it because it's the way we've always done things. But you can't actually show me any value that they're providing.
Because they don't need to. Because they're riding on this sort of like American flag waving patriotism. Like, they don't need to feel like they're accountable for a goddamn thing. And I think that's what's really frustrating about it. I've reached out to SAC PD recently. I've done PRA requests to them on, give me an itemized report on every single thing that you are spending your budget on. They can't. They don't. You have any granularity to where their budget goes because nobody cares. Nobody provides oversight. And really, I mean, this comes down to our city council side too, possibly our city manager. I don't know how that works. But like, there's no oversight and no one seems to care. And so you have bootlickers like Jeff Harris and Angelique that just sort of rally the troops and say, yeah, let's keep buying them fucking tanks. And like, this is where we are. When, okay,
But just the tank, yes. Like, honestly, like I'm here, I'm at your mercy. Just tell me what we got for this. Tell me what the impact was. Because I'm looking at my Measure U budget, and 1 year, Councilmember Eric Guerra, lobbied to get, I think it was $90,000 spent on sex trafficking. And the only thing that this department could tell me that they spent it on was staffing. And I was like, so were fewer women trafficked? Did you make a plan? Did you write a policy? Like, what was the impact on sex trafficking of us spending almost $100,000 on sex trafficking? Like, it's not a lot of money, but at some point I had to say, like, start small. What did you do with this discrete pot of money for a specific purpose?
Right.
And if you tell me FTE, I swear, folks, I'm going to lose my mind. FTE is not an outcome. FTE is a process to get an outcome. That person
acronym alert.
Job duties, full-time equivalent.
Yes.
You should telling me how much money you spent on somebody is not telling me what they did with their time. It's telling me you hired a person to do a job. What was that job? What did they do with that job? Did they
succeed?
Did they succeed?
So what you're saying, Flo, is that part of, at what point do they provide, or do they demand the same level of scrutiny from law enforcement and their expenditures that they do from community-based organizations? And
they're getting $500. Yeah. They have to write 7 reports and apply in a 20-page grant, but the police department just gets to show up and say, we need more, and oh, by the way, give us raises in the middle of COVID, and everybody rolls over and plays dead. Like, it does not make sense. I know we talk about this a lot on the podcast, but it simply does not make sense. And I really want everybody to be as angry about the fact that not only are they just getting all the money, but they've never actually written out a logic model to tell us why, to justify why they're getting all of the money.
Right. Exactly. And some folks might wonder, like, why we're asking this on an episode where we're discussing, a shooting out in the community. But it's like, more money to cops doesn't stop shootings, because it's not fewer cops is not a determinant of a shooting like this. It's just not. So my question is, what are we spending on cops? Why are we spending it? And should we not move that from the cops to the community to actually prevent these shootings from happening? How much did SAC PD have to spend on the Fab 40s protest? Not just in like all the folks they had marching out there, behind you guys, or, hitting Flo with a fucking bike, or, pulling Ryan's shoulder out of his socket, or illegally kettling and arresting 87 people. Like, and the lawsuit that came from all of that, like, should we not be considering this when we talk about what our cops are doing and what community safety really looks like?
So my brother, D'Angelo Mack, that I'm fortunate enough to work with, and you guys have heard so much of the reasons why I love working at Public Health Advocates with Ms. Flojean Kofer over there, Dr. Flojean Kofer. I haven't said that in a while, and I used to tease her about that all the time. But he said something that I thought was so eloquent and so on point today in a meeting that we had, where he said, we know that violence continues to evolve, and as such, the solutions and the approaches to violence need to evolve as well. Yet, when you look everything that you just said, Kempa, when was the last time that was evaluated? When was the last time that we actually looked at, hey, does the definition of public safety still apply current day? Are we outdated in that? Because if we continue to look at the same system, the way that it's been funded and supported, and only continue to grow from there, but we're not acknowledging, and we can acknowledge that there's 1,000 more community problems because we've done the work to understand how complex it is, yet we still won't go back to the way that we define our response to it. Are we really shortchanging our community? And is our community unaware of it because it's like, well, this is just the way it is. We don't need to talk about it again, but we're talking about every other aspect except that. And also, whose responsibility is it? Is it the communities truly to have to name the oppression, or is it the decision makers that we have elected that say we stand for you to actually say, you know what, we're not looking at this the right way. Our budget continues to go up over there, but our results continue to go down in the worst ways, or up in the worst ways. Let me put it that way as well, right? I think our homicide rates are the highest they've been in 3 years, coming out of the pandemic, which there's a number of reasons and factors I fully have to acknowledge that contribute to that.
Fully predictable, by the way.
100%. And at what point have we looked at truly investing differently into our public safety and reclassifying what's considered public safety and who's considered public safety, and really invested in those models? We haven't. I can tell you, we haven't. We've done more work to remove those from our general fund and our city budget and our city practices than we've seen to invest in that way, in a different way.
We are at time, in part because I got too yelly. So can you two answer that question that you just posited, Ryan? What to you two are the correct or more correct ways to start investing our money in ourselves? I know Mayor Steinberg came out with a big press conference with a couple of state legislators today saying, hey, we need to put funding into X, Y, and Z. Was he correct? Was he wrong-headed? I think I'm getting my answer here looking at the screen. And if he was incorrect, what is the answer?
My reaction that you saw was frustration, because this is the first time that conversation was had. At the beginning of this pandemic, when Joe Biden got elected into office, he put $5 billion towards gun violence intervention strategies. But when you distill that down to the state, county, and local level, pennies on the dollar went to the actual gun violence intervention strategies that they were talking about those dollars were designed to do. So who did it go to? So when you call for $3 billion from our state budget to do the same thing, I have to question, why didn't you do that with the money you already had available? And when you're saying, what does that look like? It's your advanced pieces. It's your IYTs. And there's a number of programs, and I don't want to disrespect anybody for naming and not naming all the different programs, but it's a part of where are we recognizing that it's not an either or, it's a both and solution that needs to go there. I don't need 10% of the 60 or 50% on the dollar that was supposed to go to community investments to actually go into those programs. I need that full 50% to go in there. Talking about Measure U specifically. When we're saying that there's a $3 billion investment that we need to make into intervention strategies and community care, well, what does that mean in terms of providing accessible mental health access, not only for the students and the young people there, but their parents as well? right? Like if I'm going to provide a counselor on the campus, and I feel like we need to have at least 20 counselors on each school campus to address social emotional needs of our students, we also need to have those same workers, or at least another crew of workers that connect to the parents at home to make sure that the follow throughs there and that there's a safety and a care plan that's implemented and followed up on, right? And I think that goes across the board. There's a number of programs that need to be there, but then also you need to continue to add in your MH first, is your mental health first for the acronym piece there, to be invested, that provide a different level of care that police are not equipped to respond to. And I'm not just saying police, fire's not equipped to respond to it either. Maybe paramedicine, but again, they're looking for emergency response to a medical need. There's a difference for quality of life needs that need to be responded to, right? And the burden that that puts on our overall general budget, but also those departments. When you look at the cost, and I'll say this last piece before I pass it to Flo, if you look at the cost of a fire truck being dispatched for a quality of life call, it will make you sick to your stomach when you consider a battalion chief has to be on there, usually a fire chief, about 3 firefighters, and 1 paramedicine. For a call that ultimately they'll show up and leave, and their salaries that are there, you would be disgusted to realize how much money we're burning on inappropriate response for these type of programs. And that's just fire, right?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna digress because there's so much to get to, but thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan pointed out a lot of the structural things that are happening here that are a real problem. I think the big takeaway here is the continuum of services. And I think we have this conversation a lot when it comes to housing. I think we have this conversation a lot when it comes, to public safety. I think we have to have this conversation when it comes to, medicine, right? Is like, we can't sacrifice doing things at multiple levels, right? We have to have an immediate response, but if you only fund the immediate response, right? You have people going out and responding to calls, and someone needs, clinical services, and you have nowhere to send them because you didn't fund the upstream stuff. Or someone needs housing and you have nowhere to put them because you didn't fund the other stuff. So you have to think about a comprehensive approach to this. You can't piecemeal this, and you can't operate in silos.
Well, we can't just police them and cite them and move them?
No, Dave, unfortunately we can't.
Oh,
And I don't
man.
know why we keep doing the same
Oh.
thing when it keeps failing. It just doesn't make sense. And so we have to think about, what are we going to invest? I mean, the thing I'm wringing my head around, it's like the same thing is happening with the pandemic, right? Like, we invested so much after the fact in trying to deal with it, and now we're not going to learn any lessons from this, and we're going to be in the same position if there's another novel virus that comes up, or when there is a climate change event, or any of those things, because we don't actually take the time to invest in every level of prevention and service that's needed. So I don't want us to not address the needs of the people who exist right now, but we got to stop having more people in the same volume of people in need. We have to do some primary prevention work. Somebody has to stop responding and start looking upstream and saying, what are we going to invest in so we have fewer people we need to respond to? And I just, all these solutions that keep being proposed are very short-sighted. We're going to do this immediately to make it seem better. And it's very similar to, doing a paint job when a full demolition is needed, right? Like, you just can't paint your way out of some of these issues. You have to take a step back and say, is our system designed for the outcomes we want? Because if it's not, then all you're doing is kind of trying to play whack-a-mole, with a problem. And, our reflexes aren't that fast.
Yeah.
And so this shooting ultimately was just a symptom of structural issues that were happening. And it shows up in an individual way. And we lost 6 human lives. I'm not like a super superstitious person, or, but like the same number of lives we lost last year in the storm, right? It's showing up in this way. Like, there's like a structural failure, and we lost some people, and that one was violent, but we don't see it that way because a gun wasn't involved. But all of these things are institutional violence because of inaction, and because we have wrung our hands instead of actually rolling up our sleeves and doing something about it. And so I want us to actually think about where our dollars are being invested. That's why I think budgets are so important. Think about what policies we're passing. That's why we should not allow our business community to hold us hostage and to push through their agendas. Think about, the volume of money we've spent on things, and do we have the data to actually show that that's valuable? And recognize that each time we don't, real people lose real siblings. And the heartbreaking, the fiance, who's standing outside with a sister, who's in the San Francisco Chronicle article, and giving each other a hug, comforting each other in their loss. That's a very tangible, real loss. These two people have been traumatized by what happened Sunday morning because of our institutional failures, and we all have to accept some responsibility for that happening and say, let's do better so that this doesn't happen to another set of families.
That's an incredibly powerful way to end this episode. I think tying these two systemic issues together in a way that, we don't necessarily want to, but our business quote unquote leaders have forced us to today. Ryan, thank you so much for coming on. I hope we get to have you again. You're just a wonderful person. It's a joy to have you on.
I love this conversation. I mean, unfortunately, the topic, but I love having these conversations and digging in with y'all. Like I said, I've been fanboying over my opportunity to get on Voices, and I'm like, man, can I get another one? I need to find some topic that they'll want to talk to me about. But one day, I believe it's going to happen again. So
we'll get you on again, and maybe it'll be in happier circumstances, so we can just joke around a bit more too, right? But no, you are, yeah, obviously one of my favorite people, one of Flo's, I'm sure, because you two are around all the time, each other. I gotta wrap it. We have gone a little too long. Skylar's going to be mad at us. So I'm going to wrap this up. I just want to say to folks, take care of yourselves out there. Please, if you need to talk to somebody, do reach out to those around you. And even if the trauma didn't affect you personally, we all process this stuff differently. Just don't be afraid to talk to folks. I guess just rounding out the episode, we love the work we do. We hope you love it too. If you do love the work we do, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/voicesrivercity, as little as $5 a month, as much as $25 a month. I am currently working on the Sac Follows the Money project. Thank you, Tibby, by the way, listener and friend, for pushing me on that and saying, hey, why are you doing this or what? Yes, I'm doing it. And then beyond that, we're at voicesrivercity.com. I am on the tweets at Kempo, YOUKNOWKEMPA.
And I am at Flojaune, FLOJAUNE. And Shannon is at ShanND Stevens. And Skylar is at Guillotine for You. That's Guillotine, the number 4, YOU. And Ryan, where can we find you?
I am at Claiborne Convo. That's at CLAYBORNCONVO. No, my picture is not on it, and that's how you know it's the right one.
Love it. All right. Thank you again, Ryan. Thank you again, listeners, for waiting a couple days on this one. I think it was important that we did, and I'm glad we did. And we will see you all Tuesday. Bye-bye. Don't hang up, Ryan.